Well, welcome all of you to the Swedish Institute of International Affairs and to this seminar where we will discuss the challenges to EU foreign and security policy, the so-called CFSP, and the role of the European External Action Service, the EEAS. So there will be a couple of abbreviations today that we will focus on, but those are two central ones. My name is Anna Wisslander, and I'm Deputy Director here at the Institute, and it's my pleasure to moderate this discussion today. And if you want to join the conversation on Twitter during the event, please do, and use the hashtag #UIEvent. It's behind me also here on the wall. Who do I call if I want to call Europe? It's a classic quote from Henry Kissinger, former US Secretary of State. And it pinpoints the problem that the European Union has been struggling with for decades and gradually also has been addressing: how to speak with one strong voice on foreign and security policy, and at the same time, as the right to veto remains with the national capitals. And also how to match its economic power with political influence on a global scale. And the gloomy developments that we have in world politics affect the European Union highly and put even greater demands on common responses and also a strategic thinking on global matters and as a global actor. The EEAS was established as a consequence of the Treaty of Lisbon, which entered into force in late 2009. And one of the key tasks of the EEAS is to ensure that all the different activities that the EU performs abroad are consistent and effective. And this is particularly important because many of the EU's foreign policy programs are organized by different divisions of the European Commission, the different body. As of 2014, Federica Mogherini has taken office as new High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, the so-called Foreign Minister of the EU, and she also holds the position as Vice President of the Commission. And this construction has been made in order to facilitate the work of CFSP. And that's one dimension that we will look a bit further into here today, how that works. And for the past years, since its establishment, the EEAS has strengthened its role as the coordinating center for the CFSP and the EU's external relations. But also at the same time, the tension between national interests and the supranational decision-making remains. And at a time where the challenges are as high as ever to the European Union. So today we will discuss issues such as what is the current state of the institutional development on CFSP, and how will the EEAS manage to respond to these issues it's faced with? And what are the most important challenges? And can these be dealt with within this prevailing setting? So it's a very great honor for us to present to you the speakers of this seminar. It's Anna-Karin, Ambassador, head of the Secretariat for Sweden's candidature to the Secretary Council 2017-2018, and previously Swedish Ambassador to the Political and Security Committee, the PSC, at the Council of the European Union. Federica Bicchi, Associate Professor in International Relations of Europe at the London School of Economics and Political Science, LSE. And Niklas Bremberg, who is a Research Fellow here at our Europe Research Program at the Institute. So a very warm welcome to all of you. We will listen to your presentations and then also have a panel discussion, open up the floor for questions and comments also from the audience. So please, Anna-Karin Enström, why don't you start?
Can you hear that's working. Great, good. Thank you so much, Anna, and thanks for inviting me. It's actually quite interesting for me to relate back to Brussels. I left Brussels in July after spending 4 years there as the Swedish representative to the Political and Security Committee. The Political and Security Committee is the committee where I, together with my 27 other colleagues, are preparing the positions, different position of the European Union when it comes to the common foreign and security policy. We do prepare the ministerial meetings, the conclusions to be adopted by the ministers in different areas. But we are also giving the strategic guidance to the different CSDP missions. The crisis management mission that the EU is sending and doing in several countries, especially in Africa. Those are both of a military nature, mainly in training military, and in the civilian area, including actually having executive mandates, as the mission we are having in Kosovo. I was in Brussels between 2010 and 2014, and these were the years where the EU External Action Service, the sort of EU's foreign service, was built up. And I saw the start, which was a bit chaotic, I must say, with a lot of child diseases. People were scattered in different buildings. They were without computers. They were some without salaries, and they were to sit together and execute a common foreign and security policy. The Arab Spring happened. It happened more or less a couple of months after the EEAS started to work, and this was, of course, doing policy while running, and I think we also saw that the beginning of the response from the European Union to the Arab Spring was a bit hesitant. It has developed, but in the beginning I think we can call it very hesitant. But I must say, during the 4 years that I've spent there, that we have seen this organization form itself and becoming something that is working quite well, both in Brussels and in the different member states, because EEAS is also having embassies more or less all around the world with personnel from the external action service. But there are lots of improvements that can be done, and I will just mention some areas where I think that the European Union should be, and then address what the challenges to that is. The EU should be a strong global actor, and it should be able to use the range of instruments that it has to its disposal. The High Representative, which actually has double hatting. She is the High Representative of the External Action Service, but she's also the Vice President of the Commission. So she must use both these roles much better than was actually the case during the High Representative Ashton's time in office. We need to have a common security and foreign policy that is based on cooperation, coordination and complementarity between the External Action Service and the Member States. We need a High Representative who can act based on the legitimacy from the Member States. We need a European Union that can handle the neighbourhood, both the Eastern neighbourhood and the Southern neighbourhood. And the neighbourhood's neighbourhood, and I will return to these concepts. And we need a European Union that can handle multiple crises at the same time. So what do we need to do? What needs to be done? We need to have a much stronger and closer cooperation between the External Action Service and the Commission. The Commission, the majority of the instruments to the disposal of the European Union, both in financial terms and in other terms, are within the European Commission. So we need to see that cooperation being strengthened. And that is mainly done through the double hatting of the High Representative, where she is also taking larger responsibility as Vice President of the Commission. I think we are seeing, since Federica Mogherini entered office, that she's trying to assume this role in a stronger and better way than her predecessor. And she's now leading the external commissioners within the Commission. That is the Commission for Humanitarian Assistance, the Commission for Trade, the Commission for the Neighborhood and Enlargement, and the Commission for Development Cooperation. All these commissioners, of course, have the responsibility for extremely important tools within the European Union. Because as we look at security right now, security is not only sending military or civilian people into different crises, it's also working with climate, it's working with trade, it's working with development cooperation, and we need to use all these different energy, extremely important. We need to use all these instruments in order for the European Union to be a strong actor. And I actually think that this is one of the added value of the European Union as a global actor. There are no other actor in the world that has the instruments to its disposal that the European Union has. We can work from conflict prevention, political dialogue, through civilian and military crisis management, to development cooperation, association agreements and trade agreements, and a membership perspective for some countries. This is unique, but we need to work in a much more coherent way in order to use these instruments, and that takes cooperation between the European External Action Service, the European Commission, but also the member states. The European Union must have a strategic vision, and I talked about the Arab Spring. When we entered the Arab Spring, we were just what do we do? What instruments can we use, and how can we that have had relations with these regimes that are now out? How can we work with the countries? And I think this is where we need to have a much more long-term strategic vision. The European Union needs to define its interest, to see what are the instruments that we can use, and how can the European Union act that makes us different from other global actors. And much has happened since the European security strategy was revised in 2008. We have a lot of new actors, global actors, working with global challenges. The member states' ownership for the common security and foreign policy is key. We need to counter some tendencies that we are seeing right now to renationalize foreign and security policy. It's extremely important that the EU's common positions, are prepared with contributions and discussions among all member states. It's very dangerous to see a path where positions are pre-cooked among some of the larger countries. And having been sitting in the Political and Security Committee, this is the arena where those positions can best be prepared. This is the arena and the forum where all member states can be part of forming common positions. The European Union needs to strengthen its neighborhood policy, and this is, I think, being looked into right now. We need to be more differentiated. We need to make difference between the East and the South. They are different. And there is differences between the different Eastern countries. There are differences between the different Southern countries. And I think this is maybe the most challenging task from the European Union side, to be able to handle its own neighborhood. In the East, how do we strengthen the partnership that we have with the 6 Eastern countries, called the Eastern Partnership? The problem now, this is mainly technical cooperation. This is how do you strengthen the legal and institutional structures in your country so that you can have a trade agreement with the European Union. It's a very technical cooperation, but this technical cooperation has become hostile. The soft power of the European Union is now problematic because what we have seen in Ukraine and Russia. So it's difficult to work. We need to look into how we can work with this instrument in the best way, taking the geopolitical situation we are seeing right now. In the south, maybe even more problematic. The positive revolutions that we saw during the Arab Spring have, maybe with the exception of Tunisia, gone in a total different direction. And how do we, as the European Union, deal with that? I think, and I'm coming to the second added value that I see of the European Union in comparison to other actors, and that is that the European Union is a value-based organization. We need to stand up for the values and principles. And this is not easy, as you might imagine, if you discuss a country like Egypt or some other countries in the southern neighborhood. So how do we strike that balance between standing up for values and principle, which is about the European Union's credibility, and promoting a stable development? And then I want to end by also mentioning the neighborhood's neighborhood, because we, in today's world, with the challenges that we are seeing that are traveling over borders, we cannot only talk about the neighborhood. We cannot discuss the countries in the North Africa without looking into Sahel, and we cannot discuss Sahel without looking into the Horn of Africa. So we need also to talk about the neighborhood, I think, and see how we can address together the challenges using our instruments to our disposal. And I think migration is one issue where we really need to work in a much larger context. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A lot of very interesting thoughts and reflections there to discuss further, and we will get back to that. And then I think I leave the floor to Federica Bicchi to continue.
Thank you. I hope this is working, and I am delighted to see a broad audience on an issue related to the European External Action Service. It is also a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation, and to be outside the UK, so I can skip the first bit that I generally put in to justify why the European Union is important and necessary, and go straight to the point, which is in a way liberating. I'll make 3 points here today, and I'll keep them brief because I'm genuinely looking forward to the discussion and the comments and the questions. The first one is I have a positive story to tell about the External Action Service in relation to the Arab-Israeli conflict. The second point will chime with what we just heard in terms of the challenge of the fragmentation within the EU and what member states do, and I'll finish by looking at Mogherini and what next. The positive story I have to tell relies on the research I have been doing on the Arab-Israeli conflict recently. And it is a bit, it might be surprising that it is a positive story, but it is a story of the European Union finally getting its acts together and implementing what it has been saying for a long time. The position of member states on the Arab-Israeli conflict has been long since clear. First of all, security of Israel, but since 1999, that has been clearly linked to the existence of a sovereign, democratic and peaceful Palestinian state. The problem was for long that there was a gap between this stated policy and what actually the EU was doing on the ground. Since 2009, however, there has been a hardening of the position of member states that really wanted to see this put into practice. And here is where the External Action Service has been able to deliver really good service and added value. because bit by bit, behind the scenes, it has clarified how to implement this position, how to make sure that the Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories did not enjoy the same type of privileges granted to the State of Israel. And we have seen that most clearly in 2013 with the adoption of the guidelines which restricted the granting of participation to Horizon 2020 to the Israeli actors acting within the 1967 borders. Since then, that position has trickled down to a number of acts, and we have seen that it is now taken for granted within the EU that it will continue to permeate all the future legislative acts that the EU puts into practice. The EEAS, the External Action Service, has been crucial in this development. The mandate of the EEAS is to bring coherence to European foreign policy, and that's what it has done. It has brought together the European Commission, all the various DGs, the legislative services, member states, and it has come up with an implementation policy that truly has added value. And I think that without the External Action Service, it would have been much, much more difficult to bring about this change. Has it made an impact on the Arab-Israeli conflict? Well, I think in a way it is changing the context within which the Arab-Israeli conflict is being played out. And when you hear, easy at least I call them easy accusations of the EU of not being sufficiently effective, it is, I think, enough to compare with the US and see, whether the US has been effective in bringing about peace. And clearly peace belongs to the local actors. But what the EU has been doing is affecting the context within which the local actors can and should negotiate. My second point, however, is a less happy story. It points to the fragmentation of the discussion among member states, especially on the issue of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the so-called Middle East peace process. Member states are not having a single discussion within the EU. The big member states have taken to have separate discussions, and this has taken two formats. One is of the three big member states, UK, France and Germany, in the so-called E3 format, which for instance was very active last summer during the last Gaza operation. And the other format is the so-called Quint, which is the five big member states, the E3 plus Spain and Italy, which monthly meet to discuss the key issues on the agenda, generally with the United States. This has led to something that is often referred as a pre-cooking the agenda or the declarations, because clearly the big five have an advantage when it comes to a discussion of 28. They not only have the knowledge, the background knowledge about what's going on the ground, but they also have a clear idea of what they would like to see in terms of change. So, what about Mogherini? She's relatively new to the job, but it is interesting to see how she is trying to make a mark on the job description. She has brought some interesting developments. One, I think probably one of the most interesting one in terms of diminishing the distance between her and the operational desks. There used to be what used to be called the 7 steps between the desk officials and Catherine Ashton. And she has been trying to shorten this chain of command in order to have a better grasp of what is going on, but also to make a better use of the resources, a tremendous amount of resources that the External Action Service can mobilize. At the same time, she has been Minister of Foreign Affairs for Italy for a while, and this has made her a bit too quick at times within the European Union, privileging therefore a quick response and to move declarations out, as opposed to consulting with all member states and making sure that everybody's on board. And therefore, this has created some tensions within the European Union, because some member states feel that the positions that she has put out do not fully represent their case. Well, and I would suggest that this is something that we keep an eye on as a potential development in the future to see how things evolve. But I'll stop here and I'll welcome questions and comments afterwards.
Thank you very much, Federica. Thank you very much for very thoughtful contributions, and I'll hand over the floor to Niklas. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Anna. Yes, I think you can hear me. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to all of you for coming and give us this opportunity to share our thoughts on this topic of the world of 2015 and challenges and perhaps also opportunities for a common European foreign and security policy. I thought, since I'm obviously as the last speaker, I think I'll try to kind of relate to the previous two in kind of three broad ways. I'm going to address or going to structure my talk along kind of three narratives in a sense. The first narrative is about the world in which the EU finds itself, or perhaps are assuming that it is finding itself, or are ascribed by others to be find itself in. The other narrative is about what then the EU can do, or how it can do these things that are set out and also touched upon by Anna-Karin and Federica just now. And the third narrative is about who then the EU is. Actually, we have also heard from Anna-Karin that the European Union is a value-based organization, and this is something different. So this is basically the third narrative that we're gonna look at here. So then the first narrative, the kind of the strategic outlook for the European Union. Obviously, this is no surprise to anyone here, of course, that the EU finds itself in a difficult spot. There are crises basically all over Europe's neighborhood. In the east, obviously, we have an ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and to the south, we have several crises and hotspots, of course, presenting the EU with certain challenges. However, the EU is not alone in this a difficult spot or difficult world. If you look at the EU's main partners or adversaries, they are in the same world as well, in a sense. And I would just like to remind you about the kind of the narratives that we were hearing just a couple of years ago. Think of how distant it now seems, the narrative of basically the new assertiveness of the BRICS, basically the big thing of 2008, 2009, when there was a big fuss about Brazil, Russia, India, China making a whole new world order for themselves, crafting the international system to their image rather than the image of the old powers, old Western powers. Think also, I mean, I don't think we have to be go as far as President Obama saying that Russia has committed a severe strategic failure in their handling of Ukraine over the past years. But of course, I mean, Russia is in a much worse spot now than it was only, or appeared to be only a year ago, with of course its economy in deep troubles and finding itself much more isolated now than it was if we remember the kind of the description of Russia as masterfully playing out Western disunity over the crisis in Syria, and you know, the discussing or the talks about drawing a line in the sand and then falling back, as was depicted on the US. So in that notion that Europe is losing weight in a world of multipolar competition, where emerging powers then screwily pursue their interests, where the Europeans are in disarray, was perhaps an appealing narrative, but is much, I think, much more now misleading in itself. Of course, protecting European security will often, or perhaps always, require others to improve theirs in itself. That is the kind of the inherent cooperative dynamics in the kind of new security environment that we're in. And many of the challenges that the EU faces are shared with others, and the limitations of strategies of self-reliance and short-term gains seem all too evident now, if it wasn't before, in a sense. So, and I think this taps into the points raised by Anna-Karin just now, in the sense that yes, EU is an organization particularly geared towards multilateral cooperation. Of course, the big question is it successful, and does it has its toolbox together, its act together, and does it basically do what we want it to do, in a sense? And in a sense, I think it's always, of course, easy to kind of, you know, have this the position of the kind of the EU bashing, in a sense, that we wanted to do more, in a sense, fulfill all our dreams, basically. But I think that in order to assess what it actually can do in these kind of more multilateral settings, we perhaps sometimes need to look for success stories in different places, as Federica also recently mentioned. One example here that I would like to highlight, obviously from the previous High Representative, is the deal, the brokering, the Ashton's. The High Representative Ashton's role in brokering a deal for with Iran on the nuclear file, and of course another important part where she played a role was when kind of handling the Egyptian crisis in the summer 2013, trying to pull regional partners together in order to de-escalate tensions within Egypt at that point. Then obviously things moved on from that point. But these examples, small as they might seem, obviously are showing us a way of what EU actually can do in kind of multilateral settings. And then, if you look at the kind of the other narratives, in a sense, of what then the EU can do, or how it can do it. If we take the example of the latest Foreign Affairs Council meeting that was held in Brussels this Monday, one of the main outcomes from that meeting, if we disregard that leaked document where you remember where the Mogherini's office were having a document saying that, or a kind of a test balloon that perhaps should have, where the EU should perhaps have a not as strong stance on Russia. If we leave that aside, some of the concrete outcomes of this meeting was very much linked to the meeting that the High Representative had with the General Secretary of the League of Arab States, and that also kind of leading to an conclusion saying that the EU and the League of Arab States should strengthen intelligence sharing on counterterrorism and other measures in this regard. Of course, as we all know, intelligence cooperation is very difficult to achieve among states. In a multilateral setting, it's even more difficult, and among multilateral organizations, I mean, we can just imagine the difficulties here. However, before we just discard this as just another piece of wishful thinking on behalf of the EU or certain member states, we should actually look a little bit more on the kind of the basis of this conclusion, and a little bit also what the context looks like as these conclusions are being made. if you look at, for instance, what has been going on in the neighborhood, we've seen recently advancements between, for instance, Spain and Morocco when it comes to police cooperation against, of course, the threat of recruitment and radicalization of Spanish and Moroccan citizens taking part in the conflict in Syria and Iraq. This is unprecedented, of course, and it hasn't. I mean, this is basically very new. It's just a couple of months old, but these kind of advancements show a little bit what kind of new dynamics are taking place within the neighborhood, if you count member states and non-members in a sense. So in this sense, of course, when you look at the conclusions from this meeting, where it's said that the EU should rely on best practices coming up from member states, on national best practices, of course, these things come to mind in a sense that there are, even though it's not clear from the documents, if you know a little bit more on the context, you can see a little bit where this is coming from. Again, just to show you an example of what actually the EU can be doing here, kind of adding a layer to these already ongoing bilateral cooperation in this field. And then if we come to the third point about the third narrative about then who the EU is, or who the EU or the Europeans are, in a sense, I think most of the times when we discuss foreign policy issues, it becomes either very abstract. We are, at least as scholars, I think, either focusing very much on drivers or structures or kind of big trends moving the fields ahead, or again, as academics, perhaps becoming very concrete. We're discussing the latest acronyms stemming out of Brussels, or the latest institutional innovations. However, of course, we can't ignore that all foreign policy has an important identity component to it, in a sense. It is the enactments of who we are in relations to others. And diplomacy, of course, is the art of kind of maintaining that separateness, perhaps in a hopefully peaceful manner. However, I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to continue with a narrative saying that there is a strict clash between the Europeans or the EU and the neighborhood or partners in our immediate neighborhood, be it in the east or in the south. And the reason for me to say I'm not arguing against that there are very important values at stake here. There always are, of course, in foreign policy. But I'm just wanting to raise the issue that in an increasingly plural societies, and increasingly pluralistic societies that we are having or experience living in our daily lives in Europe today, we can't ignore this fact that, I mean, we should also not only engage with perhaps intercultural dialogues with them, the others, but also, of course, engaging with dialogues within ourselves, within our own societies, of course, because these cleavages are not only, I mean, they are not separated by national borders, but rather with the communities that are, of course, living in different places. So in that sense, I think or basically the communities living in our societies as well, of course. So in that sense, I mean, a democratic foreign policy or foreign policy of democratic state must be open to this kind of internal debates, and also have a much more perhaps open debate on what are the reasons and the goals that a supposedly common European foreign policy should achieve, even as we contemplate perhaps robust measures in the field of security. It's basically, of course, again, the question of who are we representing and who are we speaking for as we perform our foreign policies. And I'm not, of course, assuming that we can provide the answers today, but at least I think we should open the floor for debate on these particular issues. On the narrative identity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niklas. Let's see how we do this. If we want to make, Anna-Karin perhaps has a reflection and remarks on the scholar perspectives on we have a practitioner and scholar perspective here in the panel. If you would like to comment a few on those reflections.
Is this working? Yeah. Just a few reflections on what Niklas and also Frederica said, and of course I should have mentioned that I think it was very good that you had some concrete. Both of you had some concrete examples. I think it is important. I'm a strong defender of the European Union, and I want to from the outset said that I think that the European Union already today is playing an important role as a global actor, but it can be improved. But I just wanted to give some examples in addition to the ones that we've heard from Niklas and Frederica. And I think one good example when we talk about this, how do we use these different instruments and how can we, as different actors, act together? I think the Horn of Africa is a good example where we have a strong European Union special representative. There are two military training missions. There is one military training mission. There is one executive military mission. There's one civilian crisis management mission. There is quite important development cooperation both from the European Union and from member states, and this is coordinated in a good way by the European Union Special Representative for the Horn of Africa. I think in addition to what you said on Iran, which is of course a very good example on the role that the High Representative has played, is also the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue, which prevented the crisis between Serbia and Kosovo. I think we need to and give a lot of credit to the High Representative Ashton for dealing with that. Niklas, you mentioned also the cooperation between the High Representative and the Secretary General of the League of Arab States has been extremely important when it comes to the crisis in Syria and what has happened in that region of the world. There is also a very good cooperation between the European Union and the African Union. The Political and Security Committee within the European Union and the Political and Security Commission within the African Union are meeting on a regular basis to discuss mainly the crisis in Africa, but they are also interested in some of the crisis on the European continent. And how we can both assist the African Union in the regional crisis, but also see how we can strengthen and enhance the structures of the African Union. I mentioned the Eastern Partnership. I just want to say that I think this, despite what has happened during the past year, is a success story. It is a state-building action. It is actually European Union support for building strong states in these countries. That's why I said it's mainly technical cooperation. I think there's some very important things that have happened there. And then the sort of main thrust of the crisis management, which is actually strengthening the security sector reform, the police, the army, other security sectors in different parts of the world, mainly in Africa. I think these are some examples that I should have mentioned when I spoke initially. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was wondering then if there is a good answer now to this question. I mean, who do you call when you want to talk to Europe? What do you say on that issue? How far has the EU developed, and who does President Obama call if he wants to discuss these issues? What's the panel view on this? Who wants to start? Anna-Karin.
Enough. I think the High Representative is actually I don't think Obama calls the High Representative. I think still you will have some leaders talking to each other in the world, but of course I think the High Representative is now the one who has the main responsibility for the common foreign and security policy, and she has because there's been two she has been very much strengthened in that role. That happened during Ashton, and I think that Federica Mogherini will enhance that role. There is also, of course, the head of the European Council, which is now Donald Tusk, which is maybe the one that then Obama would relate to on the EU level, because he is, of course, then the head of the European Council of the Europe's heads of state and governments.
There was some interpretations or speculations, one could say, when Mogherini was elected and Tusk was elected, that would imply that power was shifting a bit back to European Council, and Tusk would assume a greater role within foreign policy than she would, and so on. I don't know if that could feed into... You have reflections on this issue and who to call and the role between Mogherini and Tusk?
Thank you. Well, I mean, it's interesting that when we think of foreign policy, we tend to think of crisis, war, and that end of the spectrum. And in that sense, that's where the European Union is a bit at its weakest, because there are very different traditions about how to approach and justify the use of violence across the EU, and we have seen it most recently, I mean, not that recently in the case of Libya, where member states took a very different position and couldn't really find an agreement. So if that is the type of issue that is discussed, it makes a lot of sense for Obama to call single states rather than the High Representative. However, if we look at external economic relations, which can be an equally important topic of foreign policy, then we do see that the European Commission has a crucial role to play, and the negotiations between the EU and the US are definitely going to have a focal point in the European Commission. In the case, sorry, it was me fiddling with the thing. I'll leave it there. Mogherini comes in between these two ends of the spectrum. So when there are issues on which the member states have developed a strategy, have a position in place, and that needs to be activated or discussed, then that's when she's best placed to answer the phone.
I mean, just to summarize basically what Federica is saying, I mean, it's not necessarily answering who you should call in order to reach Europe, but the question is, I think, to explore how are other actual actors, partners, learning kind of whom to address in certain areas or in order to get certain tasks done. And I think that there has been learning process here, of course, definitely on the part of the United States and perhaps also actors in a sense. So are the other actors learning whom to call or what phone numbers to use in order to address which question in a sense? I think is perhaps the way of rephrases, and also perhaps take that question out of Henry Kissinger's hand and kind of giving it back to him in a sense.
So it's a bit more complex than that. You need to know it's issue-based, it sounds a bit, yes.
I mean, I think we need to bear in mind that there is sorry. There's a huge difference before and after the External Action Service came into place with the High Representative, and there are actually very close cooperation and contacts between the High Representative and the Foreign Secretary, for example, in State Secretary in the US.
So she's assuming ground as the Foreign Minister for the EU. Yes. What on the pre-cooked danger for a country like Sweden, that could be interesting also to hear a bit. The big countries still preparing. How do you act in that sense in order to strengthen these the committees and the work that is done? And what can we see ahead there with Mogherini as leader of these committees? And how to use the institutions and the structures that are now in place in order to actually avoid that kind of a few countries gathering together and deciding in advance or in actual reality what should be the result. Do you have reflections on that?
I'll be a bit British here, if possible, and I would say that the fact that the big member states meet and discuss certain issues, it's not necessarily a negative aspect, because in a way they are going to bear most of the responsibility of actually carrying out whatever action is eventually decided. So the fact that they have discussions and look at specific scenarios, etc., is, I think, part of the process. However, the key thing is whether that type of discussion feeds back into a genuine discussion within the European Union, and whether everybody's voice is heard and everybody's opinion is listened to properly. I think that is the real issue here.
I think it's important to. I agree with what Fredrika said, that consultations between member states are of course good, and I don't think we should too much exaggerate the sort of the pre-cooking, but I think it's a danger we should keep in mind. What I think is extremely important is that the EEAS and Fredrika Mogherini herself is actually consulting with member states, and we are using the structures within the European Union as the PSC to prepare positions. I don't think Sweden is actually a country that is in danger, because Sweden has a very strong voice within the European Union. But I think that there are other member states that does not have the influence and the respect and the voice that we have within the European Union, that we need to have as part of forming the positions. That's why I think it is so important that these member states structures are working properly, and that the High Representative and the European External Action Service are using this in a way to bring all the member states on board, because it's only by having that basis to stand on that she can be the voice of Europe.
And how has it been so far? Now, you have not had that position, but have you any reflections on that work so far?
I think that could be improved.
Because that was, the Russian EU-Russian dialogue was seemed to be a bit of that, when a paper was leaked with a position, as Niklas mentioned, that did not then fall resonance well in the council discussion. Niklas, do you have any reflection on that?
Just again, from a Swedish perspective, I think a little bit of what both Anna-Karin and Fredrika has been touching upon. In a sense, I think not necessarily that it has to be a problem, in a sense that we see now kind of a change of roles, perhaps, or a reversal of roles within the European Union, where certain common institutions, perhaps the Commission, is taking a lead on certain portfolios, a certain dimension of EU's external relations, whereas we will see member states perhaps being much more in the driver's seats in other parts of perhaps also much more linked to traditional security, in a sense. But again, I think from a Swedish perspective, I think there is at least a need to reflect upon what this actually entails, in a sense. I mean, as I think all of us can agree that Sweden has invested heavily in, for instance, in the common security and defense policy, in a sense, not necessarily to enhance EU military capacities, but enhance EU's crisis management capacities. And over the years now, for a couple of years, we've seen a trend in the EU where the EU is doing much more of kind of, tidying up missions, in a sense, very kind of small add-on missions. Please correct me if I'm wrong here, but in relation to what individual EU member states has been doing, perhaps alone or with other partners in kind of much more loosely formed coalitions. I'm thinking of Mali, I'm thinking of Libya, and other cases. And of course, if Sweden have this interest in having a very kind of a strong common security defense policy for certain means, and we see this trend, then there is of course a need for reflection here. And I'm sure that this is going on, in a sense, and we've seen things, of course, enhancing Nordic cooperation, even though we don't really know what that is going to bring, and also of course trying to sort out the Swedish relationship with NATO, which is also of course and links into all of this debate, this broader debate on what we can do internationally and multilaterally in the field of security. So I guess it's time for reflection, serious reflection here, that also involves broader audience and perhaps only academics and practitioners.
Do you have a comment on that? On the
EU's crisis management. that EU is now finding more or less its niche.
Okay.
Because not everyone should do the same thing. And I think what EU is actually good at is the security sector reform. And I think there are quite a lot of those missions ongoing right now. And when there's been, as you know, a lot of discussion about the military crisis management and what the European Union can do, and it was a long discussion about Libya. But I think what we see right now on the training missions in several parts of Africa, for example, I think are good examples on how to use the EU's crisis management.
Federica, do you have a comment on that? No, I think you can use you can just talk there. It's probably just that one.
I think, however, I mean, I like the idea of security sector reform. My concern here is that we do need to have a serious discussion about the political context within which it is done, because I've seen that in the case of Palestine, and I think that there is a sort of an idea that it's good to have a stronger police, etc. But we need to make sure that that's is within a framework of accountability, and there we bring in a dimension in which the European Union is not particularly strong in terms of assessing and implementing the democracy promotion chapter, because, for instance, if we are to use this tool in cases like Egypt, it would be incredibly, I would say, difficult to say the least. And therefore, I think that it's interesting to see how the EU has parts that develop quite quickly, but we have to make sure that there is always a normative dimension catching up, because otherwise it becomes technicalities as if politics didn't matter.
I think you touch upon a very interesting issue there that all of you approach from a bit different angle, but the importance of EU as a value-based organization and to integrate that into strategy at the same time as the challenges that the value base within the EU is also up for discussion, and there are changes perhaps in the constituency on how to view different things. So that's a big challenge both for the external projection and for the internal cohesion of the EU. Do you see how to work that through the coming years, or reflections on what especially to think of in that regard? Anything? Niklas, you talked about the internal cohesion.
I think we could start by saying that it's always good if you can basically have a certain amount of coherence of what you say and what you do, in a sense. I think that's a good starting point. It's, of course, it's always very easy to say and is extremely hard to achieve. One of my reflections that I had when I listened to Anna-Karin, and I think that you very nicely kind of described the situation that the EU was finding itself in at the start of the Arab Spring, basically setting up a new organizations while the neighborhood was upside down, basically, and all the previously assumed understandings of the stability of this neighborhood or the authoritarian regime in this neighborhood was of course up for grabs. I remember, just as a short anecdote, I remember attending the World Congress of Middle Eastern Studies in the summer of 2010 in Barcelona, and basically all the panels, not all, but a very large amount of the panels were on explaining the stability of authoritarian regimes. So basically the research community was of course addressing this question in a sense, that this was a puzzle, and of course everyone was of course taken aback of what is actually happening just 6 months later, of course. But I mean, coming back to what you were saying, in a sense that many people have been criticizing now the neighborhood policy for being excessively technocratic, in a sense, and I think you also are touching upon this, in a sense, saying that it runs on a logic that seems aloof and detached from basically what is actually going to work in the neighborhood and what's perhaps also people need in the neighborhood in order to actually also portray or convey the EU's image and message abroad. However, I think there is a true about this. I think there is something to be said on this. However, I'm a little bit curious to know, okay, so what are we actually saying that, okay, that's wrong, but what should we have instead, in a sense? A more politically oriented and more politically driven neighborhood policy? Sure, but where are then the political decision-making being made, and on kind of what basis, in a sense? I mean, if you permit me, the beauty of that technocratic vision is, of course, that you can have an ongoing cooperation on seemingly mundane projects, be it water purification or enhanced transport networks or good governance in public sector, or what have you, and that might actually have some effects long terms in improving the capacities and the livelihoods of these communities in the neighborhood. Of course, it is difficult when you see that this is also being done in states that are corrupt, and when you also see outcomes where you actually see that you are kind of supporting the ones that you would wish would leave and leave the state for other people, in a sense. So in that sense, of course, that's an extremely tricky issue. And yeah,
please. Yes.
Can I just briefly comment on that? I think this sort of a little bit boring technical cooperation is actually something that's very good, and I think where EU has of added value is in strengthening the institutions, because if you have strong institutions in states, then it's much more easy to have the sort of democratic and human rights developments that we would like to see. And I just take one example. When I came to Brussels, I had a meeting with the Georgian ambassador. This was 2010 in the fall, and she said, I mean, it's so boring now. I'm just meeting all these people from the Commission, and I don't have any political discussions any longer. I mean, taking 2 years back when the Georgia crisis happened. And then I said, well, this is something that is good. It's good that you now discuss the sort of the size of or the level of noise in tractors or whatever. I mean, the technical, because that is something, this is how you build a strong state. It's good that you go from being sort of in a political crisis mode to go into this slowly boring process of building a state. I think the challenge there in countries that are maybe not Georgia, but maybe if we look to the Balkans, that are in the process of accession to the European Union, is of course that how do you then phrase the message to the public? Because I don't think it's not a message to the public that we are now have this legislation on this and that, because the public, of course, would like to see difference. They would like to see cheaper food or better possibilities to travel and all that. So I think that's a challenge. But I don't think this technical cooperation is something that we need to change. I think that needs to be there. But as I said, that's easier, has been easier in the East, and that's challenged now than it has been in the South, because the governments in the South, in many of the cases, don't have the same sort of incentives or willingness to work in that way.
Okay, I think we can open up the floor for discussion. Lots of hands here, and we will have microphones, and I will ask you to please state your name and if you represent an organization here. We can start perhaps with Mark Rinnard, head of our European Research Program.
Thanks very much, and thanks to the speakers for a fantastic set of presentations. Very quickly, the PSC, a really important place where the institutions and the member states come together. But there's been a little bit of talk that the role of the PSC is changing, possibly because of the European Council being a stronger institution, possibly because national capitals are being gone to by the High Representative more possibly than the PSC. So some reflections there. To all the speakers, the question of strategy. The Institute here has been quite keen on the question of strategy. Maybe a discussion of, if the strategy discussion, the idea of revising the strategy discussion comes up again, what would be the best process by which that would take place, do you think? what has been successful in the past? How should we decide on a strategy? How should that go about it? There's talk about it now. So just some reflection on, okay, the value of strategy in general, but also the process by which we create strategy in the European Union. How would that take place?
Thank you very much. Strategic aspects. Should we take a couple of questions and then you can add up reflections? So here.
Hello, my name is Tatiana Karlslotiger. I'm an international legal consultant. And my question, well, it's clear that the challenges and the instruments that the European Union has to face, the security policy are kind of clear. But talking about states' best practices, have the states identify what the issues they are facing their own, each state? For example, Sweden now has over 100 Swedish citizens fighting in Islamic State. That itself is kind of like an internal issue that they have to tackle, right? So I just wonder if there is a list of issues each individual member has to tackle first, because like in any marriage, you have the challenges that you have to face, but you have to start by within yourself. So I don't know if there is any list of challenges by member states to practice state best practices.
Yes, thank you. We have one microphone, so perhaps one more question on this side and then we can go over to the other side. Was there any more there? Yes.
Thank you very much. Actually, I just wanted to ask two questions concerning global challenges of 2015. It was told about EU slow reactions to the Arab Spring, but we see that reactions to what is happening in Middle East is not quicker anymore. Also, because in fact was Palestine-Israeli conflict solution was mentioned, but probably it's the least harmful for diplomats conflict, because it's lasting for quite a long time, and definitely failure here will not be so visible. But it was mentioned that ISIS fighting or Shia-Sunni conflict is becoming even internal in Europe, because it affects European states, and also it affects all region of Middle East too, because there are regimes in Syria, also government in Iraq, Shia governments actually, and radicalization of Sunni populations on the other part, actually expressed by offspring of ISIS movement and clashes there. So position of the EU is not clearly visible here, except probably some bigger EU states. Another issue is definitely carefully avoided Ukrainian-Russian conflict by panelists, because definitely it will affect European geopolitics in a near and longer term future, actually. So we cannot avoid discussing this issue. And one other aspect of this conflict is that fraction is going not only between member states what concerns this conflict, but also between top management of the EU, let's say, between President of the Council and EEAS High Representative, Vice President of the Commission, which is even more actually dangerous underwater. So also it's important to know opinions, how you see this situation also. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I will turn to the panel to comment on strategy and on national challenges and on Russia-Ukraine conflict and the other dimension, please.
Okay, let me start with the PSC because there was a question about the PSC. I said in my introductory words that I think that the PSC should be used better than is actually being done right now. The PSC has a very strong mandate to coordinate and prepare the positions of the member states. But I think during the years that I have spent in Brussels, I've seen that their role has maybe been not used to the same extent as this was in the beginning. I think that the High Representative should use, as I think Solana did during his time, the PSC as a sort of a sounding board. The members of the PSC, with some exceptions, usually work very close to the political decision makers and can reflect, I think, quite easily the views of different governments. So I totally agree. I think that the PSC and PSC is actually, I think, the only body that can have this comprehensive discussion because the security concept is different now than it was years back. We need, I mean, take the Arab Spring as an example. There is not the CSDP, it's not the crisis management tools that we necessarily use there. It's how do we deal with migration, how do we deal with trade, and you need to bring that into the security discussion. And I think the PSC is the only normative body that actually can discuss these things within the European Union. On the strategy, I totally agree, and the Institute here has done fantastic work in framing that discussion. I think that this strategy needs to be kept from not being negotiated by all member states. I think we need to have a strategy that there has been a process with many different seminars sort of getting ideas into the strategy, but I don't think this is a document that you should put into working groups because then you will have something that might not be as strong as you could get otherwise. You need, of course, to have a consultation with member states, so you need to frame that in a good way, but not through a long negotiation process. Just two other things. On the challenges, I think, I mean, we all have our different challenges, but I think what is important with the European Union and the UN and all these multilateral bodies is that we need to solve this together. So no matter what sort of problems that global challenges that Sweden is facing, we need to have that discussion with other countries, and we need to find common solutions. So we might have a list of things that are sort of challenges to us, but we need to bring that discussion to the European Union or to the UN, depending on the context. And on Ukraine, I mean, I spent the past 6 months dealing with Ukraine within the European Union, and I didn't want to sort of avoid that was part of discussing the Eastern Partnership. Of course, Ukraine is an enormous challenge. Russia is an enormous challenge for the European Union. The European Union strategy to Russia is extremely important. We have looked into sanctions, as you know, against Russia as one tool to use, but also there is a very strong support for reforms and strengthening the Ukraine, because I think that's even more important when you discuss Ukraine, is to strengthen Ukraine. That's so that Ukraine can develop in an economic matter, but also its security strategies and security structures. And as you know, there is now a crisis management mission in place in Ukraine to strengthen the security sector.
Yes, please, Federica.
Yeah. On the strategy bit, I think that one of the most interesting developments of the External Action Service is the information gathering, information processing, information sharing part, which I think is probably going to have very long-lasting consequences in terms of how Brussels is fed news about the world. If we look at the extent of the diplomatic networks of member states, outside the EU, we see that the big three are very well represented. There is a group which is relatively well represented, but then most of member states cover 1/3 of the world, and that's it. The EU delegations have no such a geographical limitation, and they're now tasked with gathering, processing, and producing information and knowledge about international affairs. I see your point about focusing on the strategy bit, but I also think that more generally the information flows and the knowledge construction processes within the EU are undergoing something very interesting. On the issue of best practices and the fact that Sweden has got 100 fighters for ISIS, the UK might have a couple one as well. And I think that most of member states have the same challenge here. And therefore, the issue is really European cooperation and cooperation with non-member countries as well, because this is a common challenge, much better addressed in common than separately. And I'll bring in yet another example from the UK here. The government at one point announced that it was going to pull out of the European arrest mandate, and there was a low-key but very strong message came from the police top dogs and Scotland Yard in particular, saying, don't you dare do such a thing, because we really need European cooperation in order to go beyond our national borders. Otherwise, this is going to greatly limit our work. And the UK pulled back from that proposal and didn't touch that dossier, which I thought was a very interesting development. On global challenges, indeed, the EU hasn't got a Middle East a position on the Middle East. It's not clear what kind of crisis we're talking about in the Middle East. The only clear issue is fragmentation, a race to the bottom in terms of institution deconstructing. And I think it is particularly difficult for the European countries to address this one because it does also touch the European states. We have seen it in the southern European part of Europe, but if we again look at the UK, this was a country that was very close to see Scotland proclaim independence just a couple of months ago. And I think that there is a tendency to think that the Arab countries are these weird part of the world, with these weird challenges. But if we look at the issue of institution deconstructing, we can see it that it is much more widespread than we would like to think.
Thanks. Okay, yes, a quick point to you, Mark. Of course, I mean, the short answer to your question is that, I mean, there already is such a process here, such a strategy document that we could just pull out from the drawer, of course. The European Global Strategy, that this institute was part of is an excellent example. But I think also a little bit what Anna-Karin was mentioning, that process of doing that, even though it was a very academic exercise, of course, highlighted perhaps the problems of this kind of, multi-authored pieces in a sense. It always has to be multi-authored because it's part of what the EU is, but it has to at least be a two-step process in a sense, where you have perhaps the big consultations, the big exchange of ideas, tapping into information chains or other capacities that the EU might have and other audiences, and then of course in a more executive phase it has to be a very, I think, small exercise in order to get it. Not necessarily having Robert Cooper drafting it again as he did for the 2003 version, but of course having it much more limited in a sense. And when it comes to the issue of state best practices, I think of course the horrendous events or deeds perpetrated in Paris recently, of course, just shows the magnitude of the common challenges, and this links to your question of course, a lot of European states having this problem at home. I mean, Belgium, France, obviously, Sweden, Netherlands, a lot of countries, and I think also what happened after Paris is a sign of what perhaps we might expect, in the sense that we have interior ministers from the EU member states going to Paris, perhaps a little bit off at the margins of the common structures, but of course addressing these questions commonly, also with US counterparts and other partners. So that is a little bit, I think, where at least at start these kind of issues needs to be addressed and discussed. And of course, a marriage of 28 is of course difficult to manage anyway. So I mean, that's to bring that metaphor back. Thanks.
Thank you. We will take a second round of questions on this side of the room. Yes, so please introduce yourself.
Yeah,
also.
my name is Van Liemt. I have two short practical questions. From listening to what you say, I think conceptually you have to make a distinction between two aspects of security and foreign policy. The one is the more permanent things like trade and technical cooperation, crisis prevention, and the other one is a real crisis. Right? I think there's a difference between the two. The one gives you ample opportunity to consult everybody, and the other, you have to be quick. Now, 2 EU members are also members of the Security Council, right? So tomorrow there's a crisis. The day after tomorrow there is a meeting of the Security Council. There are 2 members of the EU present. So the question then is, do these 2 consult with their colleagues back home before they say something in the Security Council? Seems important, because if they take up a position and then a week later they meet in Brussels, it will be very difficult for either party to back down or alter their statement. So I think that's an important practical question. And the other one is also a practical question. There is always a degree of pre-cooking among the main member states. That's probably unavoidable. But the practical question is, in terms of the relation between the big 3 or the big 5 and the High Representative, is there some kind of informal division of labor whereby the main parties say, look, this is where we want to have a say first, and that is where you can handle things? I was just wondering, but there's probably not a formal one, but is there an informal division of labor between the main actors and the High Representative?
Thank you. And then we have one more question there. Yes, please.
My name is Thomas Kapadia, Sweden Indian Business Council. I also have a question of consultation to the panel, all 3 of you. Should Sweden have consulted EU before recognizing Palestine? And what kind of long-term effect will this have on the EU's foreign policy?
Thank you. Okay, so panel, last round here before we wrap up. Who wants to start? Nicholas at this point?
I think it's better if Anna-Karin or Federica start with this. I mean, it's...
Except Federica this time.
Oi. Do France and the UK consult with their member states in cases of crisis? At times they do. They don't consult maybe with everybody, that's for sure. But that's why I think it is important that the EU meetings have room also for open-ended discussions, so that some principles might emerge pre-crisis, on which member states or the High Representative can draw in case of crisis. The incentive for consulting and relying in case on principles that have been mentioned before the crisis erupted for France and the UK stands in the fact that then they'll have to go to Brussels at some point and justify their doing and their position, and being questioned by the other member states about what they have been doing or not have been doing. Both are quite good at, taking the backlash from the other member states and not bother too much about it, but they know that they're much more effective if they can speak in the name of the EU as opposed to just being France or the UK. In the sort of division of labor between the High Representative and the A3 and the Queen, this is an excellent question. It would be good if there was something as rational as that. At times, I think, especially in crisis, the definition of a crisis is when there is a breakdown of normal arrangements, and therefore, unfortunately, that entails a degree of novelty all the time. I think it is something that it becomes more sort of a daily practice as opposed to something that works particularly when in crisis. On the issue of the recognition of Palestine, I'm delighted that you mentioned it, because I intentionally didn't put it in relying on an informed member of the public to raise it. Given that we're in Sweden, and this has been one of the interesting developments so far. Recognition of countries, technically, it's not an EU matter, and therefore there is this thing. Thank you. And therefore, the issue is contested. Interestingly, it is particularly contested because of the Lisbon Treaty. Paradoxically, we have seen much more coordination in the case of Kosovo than in the case of Palestine. And I say that because of the Lisbon Treaty, a lot of member states felt that what they agreed actually exceeded what they were expecting. And therefore, they're particularly cautious now in not raising issues within the EU framework that might be then considered under the EU competence. So this creates a bit of a tension there. So what do you say, what you don't say? So there have been consultations, but not extensive ones. And therefore, this is something that definitely I'm going to research better in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you. Anna-Karin, and then Niklas get the last word.
On the Security Council, there are formats for consultations with member states when it comes to issues that are under discussion in the Security Council. Of course, as you have related to yourself, there might be a crisis that you need to react very quickly, and that consultation is then maybe done afterwards instead of before. But there are structures that work quite well both in New York and in Brussels when it comes to the Security Council, informing and discussing and consulting with member states. We have, for example, within the PSC, we had a briefer of the month, so we regularly, on a weekly basis, had one of the Security Council members, either one of the two permanent or one of the elected members, discussing with the others on the matters on the agenda of the Security Council. There's also another thing, of course, that the PSC and the Security Council are discussing more or less the same crisis. So in that sense, we have developed also cooperation between the PSC and cooperation meetings. I would say between the PSC and the Security Council. So we meet informally on the 6-monthly basis, where we can discuss then also a current crisis on the agenda of both countries. On the pre-cooking, I'm not aware of any division between the member states. I think what is important is what I've said before, that for the High Representative to be a strong voice, European voice, she needs to consult with all the member states, not only with the 3. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. On the Palestine issue, I agree with what Fredrika said. This is a national decision, and I think EU has a very strong common position on the Middle East peace process. It has very, very united and strong positions on the parameter for the peace, including the recognition of Palestine. So, and as you know, there are several member states besides Sweden that have already recognized Palestine. So Sweden is not the first country to do that. There are others that have already done that. So I don't think this is an issue that should be consulted with member states beforehand. This is a national decision.
Thank you very much. Niklas,
thank
do you have some final words?
Final words. Okay, so if you can't add anything intelligent to what the previous speakers have said, change the topic. So that's basically what I'm going to do. I'm just going to say that this has been a part of a kind of a launch of a bigger research workshop that we will have at the Institute later today than tomorrow, where we will actually explore more in depth many of these issues that you have touched upon and raised in the kind of more of the informal workings of European diplomacy or foreign policy, in a sense, not necessarily staring us blind on the institutions and institutional developments, but rather looking at other dynamics, informal, practical dynamics at play, pushing the agendas or pushing the outcomes forward. So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have a lot of interesting research outlets from this project and workshop. And thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much.